Hi, my name is Josh with Tallent, the president of eBook Architects, and today I'd like to give you a demo of FlightDeck. FlightDeck is our EPUB validation and testing tool, and it helps ebook developers and publishers and authors with the quality assurance testing for their EPUB files. Now, if you've been developing ebooks for any amount of time, you know that quality assurance is really important, and all the things that you do to create a file and to test a file can really make a big difference in how the file sells. So we definitely want to make sure that when you're building EPUB files, that you're testing them out and that you do all the steps that are necessary to ensure the quality of the file. One of the things that everybody does when testing files, EPUB files, is use EPUB check. EPUB check is the industry standard tool for testing EPUB files. It's open source and it's available online for free. It is a command line tool, which means that you run it inside the command line of Windows or in Terminal on a Mac. And you can also get some, you can use the online checker that the IDPF has, and there's some other ways of running the tool. But basically, as a command line tool, it's pretty straightforward. So here we have a command line window in Windows. I have already typed in the command to run EPUB check, and I'm going to run that right now. Now, if you've ever run EPUB check before, you know that EPUB check can give you a lot of messages about your file, a lot of information, a lot of validations and warning messages about your file. But a lot of this is also somewhat difficult to understand. It's kind of hard sometimes to know exactly what you're supposed to go fix. In this specific case, there are a whole bunch of errors. I mean, if you look through this list, it's a whole bunch of errors, and they're all pretty much the same error. So it's a kind of interesting issue to run into when you're trying to test a file. What do I start with? What do I do first? How do I fix the file? So with FlightDeck, one of the things that we wanted to do was to make that checking and validation process easier to handle. So I'm going to take that same file and run that file through FlightDeck. Now you'll notice that you can just drag and drop files into the uploader here. You can also use the Add Files button if you wanted to get a window to pop up and let you open files from your computer. Every time you run a file, it uses a token. Tokens are equivalent to titles, so you purchase tokens, either single token or multiple tokens, and you can run each title through the processing engine in FlightDeck using one token. Now, as the file is being processed by FlightDeck, you can see it's showing up here in the list, and it's showing you what status it has, what the validation processing that it's doing right now. As soon as it finishes running, we'll have access to a variety of different reports that you can take a look at the files and take a look at the reports, and it'll tell you what's going on with the file. It's almost finished here, and as soon as it's done, there we go. So you'll notice that in this files list, and I've got a whole bunch of files here in my list that I've tested before. You're given the file name, so you can remember, okay, this is the specific EPUB that I uploaded. Give the date and the processing status. And then each of these reports over on the side. The validation report's the first one we want to deal with, so let's go take a look at that. Now, our validation report in FlightDeck runs EPUB check, but in addition to running EPUB check, it actually parses through the data and figures out, okay, what do you actually need to fix? What's the problem here that's causing EPUB check to be invalid? So in this case, this specific case, it's a missing P tag. We have a closing P tag here that's missing, and if you go into this file, section 13.htm, on line 518, you'll be able to find the issue and fix the file. So that's really important. You really want to be able to very easily understand what EPUB check is telling you. And there's a big difference between the FlightDeck report and the EPUB check messages that you get through EPUB check directly. So in addition to the validation, another big part of what FlightDeck does is give you best practices. Now in this file, the best practices are certain things that we think are important, things that we've seen through the development of ebooks over the last decade that are very important for processing good ebook files, but they're things that don't make a file invalid. So these would be things that don't break EPUB check, but they're important anyway, and they're things that you should consider as you're building good files. One of those things might be a black text, right? If you have text that is specified as being black in your style sheet, then that can actually mess with the night reading mode in certain devices. So we're going to tell you, okay, all of these styles here in your style sheet have black specified as the color. You should probably go and remove that. Other things in here are also very important, like inline styles or the beginning of the content being marked in your guide or your guide being set up properly. Now, some of these things in the best practices may apply or may not apply to your book. Some books, one of the things we're testing in the best practices is the page list. Do you have the page numbers for the print book embedded as anchor links inside of your ebook? And in some cases, there is no print version of the book, so there's no reason to have a page list. So you could ignore that. It's just set up as a warning, not as an actual error. So let's go take a look again at some of the other reports that we have available. I'm going to switch over and go to one of the titles. This is the same book, but without that error in the in FlightDeck validation. So let's go to the retailer acceptance grid. Now the retailer acceptance grid is really important. This grid gives you information about each and every retailer in the US, all the major ebook retailers, and tells you whether your file would be accepted by those retailers. So in this case, with EPUB check fixed, and we've got that closing p tag already fixed in this file, we can see that it would be accepted by Apple, Barnes & Noble, Google, not by Kobo, but it would be accepted by Kindle and NetGalley. Those are the 6 companies, the 6 retailers that we're currently testing the files against their standards. For Apple, we're actually testing using Transporter. So if you've ever had problems where you've completed the development of a file, you gave it to the distribution team in your publisher, and they sent it to Apple. Apple came back with a list of issues that you needed to fix, and then had to go back through the chain back to you, and this whole communication thing back and forth between you and your other team that does distribution. This actually changes the whole game for that. You don't have to worry about that back and forth anymore, because you'll know before you even get to Apple whether it's going to pass through Apple's validation tools. So for each and every one of these retailers, we've worked with the retailers directly to try to figure out what it is that they're testing on their side and ensure that what you're being told in the retailer grid is up to date with the latest standards. Some of the retailers have more complex validation routines that they run than others, but all of this is intended to help your process and your book development be a lot easier. I'm going to go back to my files list again. I'm going to switch over to a different book, and this is the Book of Texas is just a sample book that I've created. And then this retailer grid, it points out a couple of things that I'd like to really point out to you. One thing is FlightDeck recognizes both EPUB 2 and EPUB 3. So if you're developing EPUB 2 files, which is pretty common in the publishing industry, it's the most standard format that's out there. It'll recognize that it's EPUB 2. It also recognizes EPUB 3, so if you're doing development on new EPUB 3 documents and you're trying to learn how EPUB 3 works or implement EPUB 3 in your documents for all of the different retailers, this will help tremendously as you're developing those ebook files. It'll tell you what kind of issues you might need to fix and what kind of issues you'll run into with the retailers if you're moving to an EPUB 3 workflow. So for instance, this EPUB 3 document is just a pure EPUB 3 document. It doesn't have any kind of EPUB 2 backwards compatibility in it. And so one of the things that's pointed out is that, hey, Barnes & Noble won't accept an EPUB 3 file unless it has an NCX file inside for backwards compatibility. Now, if you're not sure what to do about some of these things and how to fix some of the issues that you see in here, FlightDeck actually comes with a handbook. The handbook has a lot of really important, really good information about how to fix your files and how certain issues can be resolved. So we have information about adding fallbacks and doing, zipping up EPUB files, doing file encoding. And then for EPUB 2 and EPUB 3, we actually split out some of these issues to give more detail. So if you're wanting to embed media, audio and video in your content in an EPUB 3 file, then we give you information about how to do that. And each of these pages gives not just specifications, but also gives example code, so you can copy and paste the example code and edit it to your specific needs. Let's go back to our list here, and I'm going to go into the stats page. And the stats page is really important as well. This information is, some of it's actionable and some of it's not, but the information in the stats page will give you more data about your book. One of the first things that we find is that whenever you're doing QA on a book, it's important to test all the links, especially if you have a lot of links in your book that point out to the web. It's good to be able to know whether those links are valid and whether they point to the right locations. So one of the things that we're testing for is giving you a list of those links. You can click on these and go and check them out. And if you find that one of them is broken, you can actually see, okay, it's in this HTML file. So if I go into that file and look for this link, I'll be able to fix it there. We're also telling you in the stats page about the embedded fonts. Any font that's embedded in the file is listed here on this page, the characteristics of the text itself, and then the file sizes. And this is really helpful if you're trying to keep your file size down. Some of the retailers have very small limits, so 10 or 20 or 50 megabytes as a file size limit for your EPUB files. So it's really important to know where the file size is. If you have a lot of images or if you have video content, you might run into these upper limits. So the stats page will tell you, okay, these different files are the most numerous. So we have JPEGs take up the most space in this EPUB file, 6.4 megabytes. And the largest files in the document are actually these images. So if I were wanting to get my file size down, let's say the total EPUB file is 9 megabytes, right? So that's 9 megabytes zipped. If I wanted to get it down to 8 megabytes or 5 megabytes or something, I could go in and look at these specific files and take a look at the size of them and try to reduce the size of those files to make it easier. There's other information here on the stats page as well about the image dimensions in your book, header levels, and the table of contents, just information that's helpful to you as you're trying to figure out what to do. Now, another thing that's really important and another really great tool here in FlightDeck is the metadata editor. If you're trying to make sure that the content of your metadata file is correct, a lot of times, especially publishers who outsource over their data overseas, their ebook development overseas, when the file comes back, one of the things you have to do is update the metadata in the file to ensure that it matches with the metadata for the book itself. Because a lot of times outsourced vendors don't have that information. The metadata editor will let you do that and do it very well. So in this metadata editor, again, it recognizes EPUB 2 and EPUB 3. It'll give you the ability to add and remove features depending on what kind of file you have. So if you're doing EPUB 3, like again, this is an EPUB 3 reflowable file. You can put in subtitle and file as, and those will be listed in the metadata, in the DC metadata, correctly in the correct form. You can also add creators and contributors. So if you have actual creators like authors and contributors, other people who contributed in some way to the document or to the book, and then the other things like subject list, including being able to select bisect codes and description of rights. So these are the common metadata pieces that are used in most ebook files. Even though some retailers will overwrite this data with the other data that you give them when you upload the file, it's still good to have this information in there. And so ebook FlightDeck will let you do all the changes to that. So that's essentially what FlightDeck does. The goal of FlightDeck is to give you a much easier, much more understandable way of fixing your files. If you're doing validation with your files and you're outsourcing your files somewhere else, or you have a development team in-house and you're in charge of just doing QA, one of the great things about FlightDeck is that you can get the reports for each of these pieces and give those reports to your people. So if you run the validation here and you see that there's an issue in EPUB check, you can just download a PDF version of that report and give it to your team who creates the ebooks. Also, if you go to the files page, you can download a combined report for that book as well, and that'll combine the stats, the validation, best practices, and the retailer grid all into one PDF file, so you can give that to your people. That's the way FlightDeck works. That's the basics of using the system. We'd love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear your thoughts about how the system works for you. If you have any questions, feel free to use the feedback button at the bottom of the website here, or you can call us on our information is 978-225-2757. We'd love to hear from you and love to see you using FlightDeck to validate your files. Thank you.